A millionaire was crying after losing his son in a fire. While he was at his lowest, a boy wandering the streets came up to him and said, "Sir, your son is still alive." The city stretched beyond the window, a vast sea of neon and headlights, pulsing with restless energy. New York never slept, and neither did Jonathan Calloway. The office was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the polished mahogany desk. A phone vibrated against the desk. A notification flashed across the screen, "Security system error, Calloway residence." He glanced at it, then dismissed it without a second thought. Probably a malfunction. Nothing urgent. The house in Greenwich was built like a fortress. Jonathan rubbed his temples, letting out a breath as he reached for his coffee, now cold. The silence in the office was comfortable, familiar, until the phone rang. The tone was sharp, insistent. He answered. "Mr. Calloway?" The voice on the other end was tight with urgency. "There's been a fire at your residence. You need to come, right now." His breath caught. "What?" The line crackled. Then the dispatcher spoke again, more forceful. "Your house, sir. It's burning." For a moment, Jonathan didn't move, didn't breathe. The world narrowed to the sound of his own heartbeat, hammering against his ribs. Then he was up, knocking over the chair, grabbing his keys. He barely registered the elevator ride, the way his pulse roared louder than the hum of the city. By the time he tore onto the streets of Manhattan, weaving recklessly through late-night traffic, his mind was already at the house. Galvin. His son's name echoed through his head, over and over, drowning out everything else. The Calloway estate sat on a sprawling acre in Greenwich, an architectural marvel of glass and steel. But now, it was a beacon of destruction, flames licking at the night sky, thick black smoke curling upward like a living thing. Fire trucks lined the driveway, red lights flashing, painting the scene in harsh, unnatural pulses. Firefighters moved in coordinated chaos, their silhouettes against the inferno making them look almost weightless. Jonathan barely heard them shouting as he ran. "Sir, stop!" Hands grabbed at his arms, trying to restrain him, but he fought, shoving past bodies, heat rushing toward him in waves. "Galvin!" His voice broke as he called for his son, as if shouting could somehow pull the boy from the wreckage. "My son is in there." A firefighter gripped his shoulders, strong and immovable. The second floor collapsed. "There's no way. I need to go in." Jonathan pushed against him, but the man didn't budge. "You can't." Jonathan's breath came in short, ragged gasps, his chest heaving as the words registered. He shook his head violently. No, this isn't happening." His eyes darted to the house, the place where he had watched Galvin play in the backyard, the place where his wife once laughed in the kitchen, the place that had been their home. And now, it was crumbling. Glass shattered as another window exploded outward, flames consuming everything in their path. A gust of fire shot up through the roof, sending embers into the air like dying stars. Jonathan fell to his knees, his hands digging into the damp grass. The ground beneath him trembled with the force of destruction, but he felt numb. Someone was talking. Maybe a firefighter, maybe a paramedic. He barely processed the words. No one made it out from the second floor. It felt like drowning, like someone had reached into his chest and crushed his lungs in their grip. Galvin, his little boy, who always waited at the window for him to come home, who had gone to bed clutching that stupid stuffed bear because it made him feel safe, gone. A distant roar filled his ears. Whether it was the fire or the sound of his own grief, he couldn't tell. He stared at the house as it caved in, piece by piece, until all that remained was a smoldering ruin. The night was dark, but the flames reflected in his eyes, burning long after everything else had turned to ash. The fire had been extinguished, but for Jonathan Calloway, The flames had never gone out. They lived beneath his skin, in the wreckage of his mind. Weeks had passed, maybe months. He no longer kept track. His office in Manhattan stood empty, the glass-walled empire he had built now nothing more than a mausoleum of abandoned deals and unanswered calls. His name, once a staple in the real estate world, had begun to fade from relevance. Headlines moved on. Investors whispered. Employees wondered if he would ever return. But Jonathan did not care. He had walked away from it all. The company, the reputation, the meticulously planned future. Because the only thing that had ever mattered had turned to ash. Now, he existed in a cramped apartment in Brooklyn, a far cry from the sprawling estate in Greenwich. It smelled of stale whiskey and dust, the air thick with neglect. The furniture was sparse, the walls bare. The only sound was the occasional hum of traffic filtering through the thin windows. This place was not a home. But then again, neither had the mansion been. The liquor store on the corner knew him now. The old man behind the counter never asked questions when Jonathan showed up near closing time, hollow-eyed and silent, sliding a bottle across the counter with the efficiency of routine. It never lasted the night. The cycle was the same. Drink until the edges blurred, until the pain dulled, until the weight of his own failure felt a little less crushing, but it never really disappeared. The past found its way in, no matter how much he drank. Some nights, he would wake to the echo of his own voice screaming Galvin's name. Other nights, he wouldn't wake at all, just sink into the dark, the same way his son had. But the worst were the nights when he remembered. The memories came like ghosts, uninvited and relentless. Galvin, at 6 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor of Jonathan's office, building skyscrapers out of wooden blocks. "Is this what your buildings look like, Dad?" Jonathan had barely glanced up from his laptop. "Bigger." Galvin had nodded solemnly, as if absorbing some great truth. "Then I'll make it bigger." And he had. The boy had stacked the blocks with careful precision, eyes bright with focus, determined to reach the ceiling. But Jonathan had been too busy to watch. Too many emails, too many meetings, too many things that, in the end, had meant nothing. Another night, Galvin at 8, waiting by the front door, pajama-clad, stuffed bear clutched in his arms. "You said you'd be home before bedtime." Jonathan had sighed, loosening his tie. "I know, buddy. Next time, okay?" The small nod. The way his son had tried to pretend, he wasn't disappointed. Jonathan had kissed him on the head, had handed him a new toy, some expensive thing picked out by his assistant, and had convinced himself it was enough. But it had never been enough. Now, there would be no next time. No chance to undo the neglect, to trade 1,000 broken promises for just one moment more. What good was all the money in the world if he had spent his son's life being too busy to live it with him? The apartment was a graveyard of unopened mail and ignored voicemails. His phone, somewhere beneath a pile of discarded clothes, had long since stopped ringing. His assistant had called for weeks. "Jonathan, the investors are getting nervous." His lawyer had tried next. "You need to handle the estate, the damage claims, His business partners had left messages he hadn't listened to. Eventually they all stopped. The silence should have been a relief. It wasn't. The days bled into one another. He rarely left the apartment, save for cigarettes and liquor. The only thing keeping him tethered to reality was the nightmare. The dream always began the same way. Galvin in his bedroom, curled up in bed, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. Then, the crack of glass, the hiss of fire, smoke, thick and suffocating, Galvin sitting up confused. "Dad?" Then the flames swallowed the room whole. Jonathan always woke gasping, hands shaking, drenched in cold sweat. And then he drank, because what else was there to do? The knock at the door came late. Jonathan was on the couch, an untouched glass of whiskey in hand, watching the ice melt. No one ever knocked. He ignored it. Another knock, louder this time. He let out a breath, rubbing his face, willing the intruder to go away. Silence. Good. Then, 3 more knocks. Rapid. Insistent. Jonathan swore under his breath, forcing himself to his feet. His head was heavy, his body sluggish. He opened the door with no real intention of dealing with whoever was on the other side. And then he froze. A boy stood there. Thin, unkempt. Clothes too big, sneakers scuffed and torn. But it was his eyes that caught Jonathan's attention. Sharp, calculating, scanning the apartment with an intelligence that did not belong on a kid's face. The boy shoved his hands into his pockets, shifting his weight. "You, Jonathan Calloway." His voice was steady, but there was something guarded beneath it. Jonathan stared. "Who the hell are you?" The boy tilted his head slightly. "My name's Lionel." A beat of silence. Jonathan had neither the patience nor the interest for whatever this was. "Not a good time, kid." He moved to close the door. Lionel stuck his foot between it. "I think you'll want to hear what I've got to say." Jonathan's grip on the door tightened. "I doubt it." The boy didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out something small and crumpled. And then, Jonathan stopped breathing. It was a photograph. A grainy image, taken at night. A car, parked outside a house. His house. The night of the fire. Jonathan stared at it, heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Lionel held his gaze. "They took your kid." The world tilted. The whiskey glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the floor. The silence between them stretched thin, a fragile thread on the verge of snapping. The shattered whiskey glass glistened under the dim glow of the kitchen light, amber liquid seeping into the cracks of the worn hardwood floor. Jonathan barely registered it. His mind was locked onto the grainy image Lionel held between his fingers. A black SUV, parked outside the Calloway estate, the night of the fire. Jonathan's pulse hammered against his ribs. His throat tightened, dry and constricted, as if the air in the apartment had suddenly turned too thick to breathe. "Say that again," he said, his voice low, dangerous. Lionel tilted his head, studying him the way a street cat might gauge whether a stranger was worth trusting. He was too calm for a kid, his face unreadable. "They took your kid." Jonathan's fingers curled into fists. "Who?" Lionel didn't answer immediately. He pulled the photo back, tucking it into his jacket like a bargaining chip. His eyes flickered across the room, noting the clutter, empty bottles, discarded papers, the suffocating weight of neglect. "Maybe I come in first," Lionel said. "Not really the kind of thing you talk about in doorways." Jonathan hesitated, his instincts screaming against the idea of letting some stranger, some kid, into his space. But the photo, the words, they gnawed at him, scraping against his skull with an unbearable force. He stepped aside. Lionel walked in without hesitation, hands still buried in the oversized pockets of his jacket. He moved carefully, like someone who was used to being in places he wasn't welcome. He gave the apartment a quick once-over, unimpressed, before dropping into the worn-out armchair across from the couch. Jonathan shut the door and turned to him, arms crossed. "Talk." Lionel leaned back, casual in a way that felt deliberate, like he had the upper hand in this conversation, despite being barely more than a kid. "I was near your house that night," he said. "I sleep wherever I can. Sometimes people leave their garage doors unlocked. Sometimes it's an alley. That night, I was in the park across the street." Jonathan stiffened. His stomach churned at the thought. His son had been taken, his house had burned, and all the while, someone had been watching from a distance. Lionel continued, unfazed. "I saw a car pull up. 2 guys got out. They weren't in a rush, weren't looking around like they were scared of being seen. They just..." walked in. Jonathan's breath came slow and sharp. He pictured the scene, his mind painting over Lionel's words with his own worst nightmares. They weren't firefighters, Lionel added. And they weren't running. That was the weird part. When you see smoke, people panic. They rush in, they rush out. These guys, they went in like they had a plan. Jonathan clenched his jaw. And when they came out, Lionel's expression darkened. He reached for his pocket again, pulling out a second photograph. He hesitated for half a second before tossing it onto the coffee table. Jonathan picked it up. The image was blurry but clear enough. The same SUV, doors open, two men dressed in dark clothing. And between them, something wrapped in a thick cloth, a small shape. Too small. Jonathan's stomach twisted. They put whatever that is in the back seat, Lionel said. His voice was quieter now, like he understood the weight of what he was saying. Then they left. Jonathan exhaled sharply, his body trembling from something deeper than rage. He should have known. From the beginning, he should have known. The fire had felt wrong from the start. The way the blaze spread too fast. The way the security system had mysteriously gone offline. The way the police had been too quick to write it off as an accident. And now this. He gripped the photograph tightly, his knuckles white. Why are you telling me this? Lionel shrugged. Figured you'd want to know. Jonathan narrowed his eyes. Bullshit. Lionel smirked, but there was no humor in it. All right. Maybe I don't like the idea of someone getting away with something that big. There was something guarded in the way he said it, something unspoken. Jonathan had spent years reading people, navigating deals where every word had weight. This kid, he had his own reasons for being here. But right now, Jonathan didn't care. You said you saw them. Could you recognize them? Lionel shook his head. Not clear enough. But the car, the plates, that's something. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, breathing deep. His pulse was a wildfire, burning through his veins. He hadn't felt this kind of energy in months, not since before the fire, before he lost everything. Because maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost everything after all. He looked at Lionel again, really looked at him this time. You don't just go around helping people like me, Jonathan said. You want something. Lionel held his gaze for a long moment. Then, finally, he gave a small shrug. Maybe. Jonathan let out a slow breath. He didn't have the patience for whatever game the kid was playing, but he needed answers more than he needed to interrogate motives. His mind snapped into focus. Galvin wasn't gone. He had been taken, and Jonathan was going to find him. He picked up the photograph again, staring at the SUV, the first real lead. He turned back to Lionel. You willing to help me track them? Lionel's lips curled slightly, a flicker of something knowing in his expression. Depends, he said. You willing to stop drinking long enough to do it? Jonathan clenched his teeth. The sharp jab stung, but he didn't have time for pride. Because Lionel was right. The man he had been for the past few months, the wreck drowning in whiskey and regret, wasn't going to save his son. But that man was dead now. Jonathan Calloway stood up, took the last remaining bottle of whiskey from the table, and, without hesitation, smashed it against the sink. The glass shattered, liquid spilling down the drain. Lionel's brows lifted slightly, but he didn't say anything. Jonathan turned back to him. Let's go. Lionel smirked. Now we're talking. And just like that, the hunt began. The air outside was thick with the weight of the city. Brooklyn at night felt different from Manhattan, grittier, rougher around the edges. The streets hummed with a quiet kind of life, the kind that didn't sleep, that thrived in the spaces people tried to ignore. Jonathan drove in silence, his hands clasped in silence. Lionel watched the city pass by through the window. They said nothing. The photograph, the SUV, the possibility. It was the first real lead he had, but it wasn't enough. He needed names. He needed proof. He couldn't let himself think about it. He couldn't let himself hope. But he couldn't let it go either. "Where are we going?" Lionel's voice cut through the silence of the car, but Jonathan kept his eyes on the road. The city blurred past in streaks of orange and white, the late-night traffic humming like a restless beast beneath them. "To someone who can actually help us." Lionel raised a brow. "You mean someone who won't get us arrested for showing up with stolen evidence?" Jonathan smirked. "Something like that." Jonathan remained quiet. Jonathan stopped in front of an old brownstone. Its windows dark, except for the faint glow of a desk lamp on the second floor. The brass nameplate next to the door read, "Rachel Bennett, Private Investigator." She wasn't just another private investigator. Jonathan had heard of Rachel Bennett, a former NYPD detective known for being relentless, for digging up things that people didn't want found. She'd left the force after butting heads with the wrong people and started working in the shadows instead. If anyone could make sense of this, it was her. And if there was one thing everyone agreed on, it was this: Rachel Bennett did not take cases she couldn't win. Jonathan knocked twice, then stepped back. They waited. Jonathan clenched his fists, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. If this was a mistake, if this was another dead end. The door opened. Rachel Bennett was in her late 40s, sharp-featured with tired but perceptive eyes. She wore an old hoodie and jeans, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She took one look at Lionel, then shifted her gaze to Jonathan, her expression unreadable. "You look like hell," she said. Jonathan swallowed back the sharp reply forming on his tongue. He wasn't here to make friends. Rachel leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "So? What do you want?" Lionel spoke before Jonathan could. "We need you to look up a car." Rachel exhaled through her nose, already annoyed. "You know, I don't run a charity." "I don't," Lionel admitted, then jerked his thumb at Jonathan. "But he does." Rachel studied Jonathan again, this time with more interest. "Calloway," she murmured. "Didn't recognize you without the suit. Thought you were dead." "Not yet," Jonathan said flatly. She held his gaze for a moment, then stepped aside. "Fine. Come in." Her office was small but organized. Stacks of case files lined the bookshelves, and a corkboard on the wall was cluttered with photographs, notes, and maps, with lines connecting locations like a web. Rachel gestured for them to sit. Jonathan remained standing. "All right," she said, sitting behind her desk. "Let's hear it." Jonathan reached into his coat and pulled out the photograph Lionel had given him. He placed it on the desk, sliding it toward her. She glanced down, then frowned. "Where was this taken?" "Outside my house," Jonathan said more. "The night of the fire." Rachel's gaze snapped back to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. She picked up the photo, studying it. "These men," she said slowly, "you think they set the fire?" "I think they took my son," Jonathan corrected. "And I think someone wanted me to believe he died in that fire." Rachel leaned back, tapping her fingers against the desk. "So you're telling me the official report is bullshit?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Yes." She considered him for a long moment. Then she sighed, pulling her laptop closer. "What do you need?" "The SUV, Lionel said. "Find out who owns it." Rachel nodded, already typing. The room fell into a tense silence as she worked, the only sound the quiet clicks of the keyboard. Jonathan paced near the window, his thoughts a storm of rage and hope. If this lead fell apart, if this ended up being nothing, Rachel made a noise in the back of her throat. Got something? Jonathan turned sharply. What? Rachel rotated the screen so they could see. A vehicle registration form filled the display. That SUV is registered to a company called Blackwell Security, she said. Jonathan's stomach dropped. Lionel frowned. That's supposed to mean something? Jonathan clenched his jaw. I hired them. Rachel's eyes flicked up. What? They installed the security system at my house, he said, his voice tight. Cameras, alarms, everything. Rachel's face darkened. Then it wasn't just a fire. No, Jonathan said, his voice a whisper now. It wasn't. Rachel turned back to the laptop, pulling up another window. I'm going to run a deep check on Blackwell Security, see if there's anything shady. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up corporate records, employment history, anything that left a trace. Then she stopped. Oh, shit. Jonathan stepped closer. What? Rachel pointed at the screen. The night of the fire. Your security system was disabled. Remotely. Jonathan felt something sharp twist in his chest. Rachel kept going. Looks like someone logged into your system an hour before the fire started. Shut off the alarms. Wipe the cameras. Jonathan's breath came slow and shaky. Who? Rachel clicked again. A name popped up. Jonathan froze. William Harrington, his rival, his enemy, the man who had spent years trying to outmaneuver him in business. And now, the man who had taken his son. Jonathan felt his hands tremble, but it wasn't from fear. It was rage, deep, cold, controlled. Rachel looked up at him. You know him? Jonathan's voice was steady. Yeah. Rachel sat back. So what's the play here? You want to go to the cops? Jonathan exhaled slowly, his mind calculating 1,000 things at once. No, he said. Not yet. Lionel, silent until now, grinned slightly. Good answer. Rachel shook her head, rubbing her temple. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'll help. Jonathan looked at her. Why? She leaned forward, her expression unreadable. Because you're not the only one who wants to take down Harrington. And just like that, the hunt became a war. The office was silent, except for the rhythmic clicking of Rachel's keyboard. For almost an hour, she had been working relentlessly, making calls, searching through private databases, bypassing security layers, pulling every string she had left. Jonathan sat motionless, staring at the screen, his mind running in circles, his body tight with anticipation. The name on the screen burned into Jonathan's mind. William Harrington. Lionel paced nearby, restless energy radiating off him, fingers twitching like he wanted to grab something just to break it. Then, Rachel stilled. Her eyes narrowed slightly, lips pressing together. A shift in her expression. Jonathan leaned forward, pulse hammering. What? Rachel exhaled, turning the screen toward them. Here it is. Rachel exhaled slowly, scrolling through the logs again. Your security system was disabled at 11:42 p.m. The fire started at 12:15. No coincidence. Jonathan's eyes scanned the information, his stomach twisting into a knot. The car is registered to a private security company. His breath hitched. His mind immediately started racing through possibilities, explanations, excuses. Which company? Rachel hesitated for just a second before answering. The same one that installed the security cameras in your mansion. Jonathan's world tilted. Everything inside him went still. No, he whispered. That's impossible. It isn't, Rachel replied, voice steady. Someone within the company must have tampered with the recordings before the fire. Jonathan clenched his fists. His own security team, the people he paid to protect his home, his family. Rachel tapped at the keyboard again, pulling up more data. But they made a mistake. Jonathan looked up sharply. What mistake? Rachel's fingers danced across the keys. Instead of deleting everything, they only overwrote part of the file. Jonathan inhaled sharply. That means we can still recover fragments from the night of the fire. The room suddenly felt smaller, the weight of the realization pressing down on him. And then, a memory surfaced. A message. Unimportant at the time, forgotten in the chaos. Jonathan's hands tightened into fists. The same day of the fire, he muttered, half to himself. I got a system notification. It said there was an outage, unscheduled maintenance. Rachel's gaze snapped to him. And you didn't think that was suspicious? Jonathan exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. At the time, I didn't care. His voice was rough, edged with something bitter. I didn't care about anything except that my son was gone. Rachel nodded slowly, processing. That outage wasn't maintenance, Calloway. She glanced at the screen, her expression darkening. They shut down your security system on purpose. Silence hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply. Jonathan swallowed hard. Can you recover anything? Rachel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into a drawer, pulling out a small external hard drive. There's a way to retrieve deleted security footage, but it's tricky. Sometimes data gets wiped, but fragments remain. She plugged the drive in and opened a new program. If there's anything left, I'll find it. The screen filled with code, a steady stream of numbers and corrupted files flickering past. The wait stretched unbearably long. Then, something, a distorted frame, a glitch of static, and then a grainy, flickering video. Rachel hit pause. Jonathan leaned in, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The footage was rough, pieces missing, but it was there. The front entrance of his estate. The timestamp read 11:57 p.m., 18 minutes before the fire started. 2 men entered the house. They were dressed in dark clothing, moving with calm efficiency. No signs of panic, no hesitation. Rachel pressed play again, the footage stuttering. Then, suddenly, the video jumped forward. 12:08 a.m. The 2 men were leaving, and they weren't alone. Jonathan's stomach clenched as the frame shifted, catching a glimpse of something between them. A shape, small, wrapped in dark fabric. His breath caught. Number. Rachel paused the footage, her finger hovering over the keyboard. She enhanced the image, sharpening the pixels, pulling more details from the shadows. And then, there it was. A hand. A child's hand, limp, barely visible from beneath the fabric. Jonathan stumbled back, gripping the edge of the desk. His knees felt weak, his body suddenly too heavy to stand. Galvin, he whispered. Rachel didn't say anything. Lionel, still on the couch, exhaled sharply. Damn. Jonathan's mind spun. It wasn't a theory anymore. It wasn't a hope. It was real. They had taken his son. They had stolen him from that house, while the fire was still waiting to consume everything. They had wanted him to believe Galvin was dead. He ran a hand over his face, trying to steady his breathing. But the rage, it was boiling now, uncontrollable. Rachel clicked out of the video. This confirms it, she said quietly. This wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up. Jonathan turned to her, his voice dangerously even. You can track them. Rachel hesitated. The security feed is local. No external cameras caught them leaving, but I can try running the SUV's plates through city traffic cams. It won't be easy. Harrington's people know how to stay under the radar. Jonathan clenched his jaw. Do it. Rachel nodded and started typing again, but Lionel was still watching Jonathan carefully. You okay? the kid asked. Jonathan didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure what he was. He had spent months drowning in grief, believing his son had been lost in that fire. Now, the truth was like a knife to the ribs. They had taken him, and he had done nothing. That changed now. Rachel clicked again, pulling up company records. Blackwell Security is a front, she said. They do legitimate work, but it's a shell for something deeper. Illegal protection services, intimidation, corporate sabotage. Jonathan's hands tightened into fists. And Harrington owns them. Rachel nodded. Not directly, but through 3 layers of shell corporations. It's deliberate. He keeps himself insulated, but make no mistake, this is his operation. Jonathan could barely see straight through the sheer fury clawing its way through him. He had spent years going up against Harrington in the corporate world. Deals, contracts, boardroom battles. But this was different. Harrington doesn't just want you ruined, Rachel said, her voice steady. He wants you erased. Jonathan inhaled deeply. Then we erase him first. Rachel leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. If you want to take him down, you need a plan, a real one, not just charging in like a man with nothing left to lose. Jonathan met her gaze, his expression hard as steel. I don't have anything left to lose. He gestured at the screen. I have him. Rachel held his stare for a long moment. Then she nodded. All right. Jonathan turned to Lionel. You in? Lionel gave him a lopsided grin. Hell yeah! Rachel exhaled. Then let's get to work. The plan started with a location. Rachel sat at her desk, her screen illuminated with satellite imagery. The estate was vast, isolated deep in the woods of Hudson Valley, shielded by tall iron gates and dense trees. The property was owned by a holding company, but the paper trail led straight back to Harrington's network. This is it, she muttered, zooming in on the structure. Jonathan leaned in, his jaw tight. How many men? Rachel exhaled. Hard to say. If this is where they're keeping Galvin, they won't leave him unguarded. Blackwell Security isn't just a bunch of rent-a-cops. They're professionals, ex-military, mercenaries. We walk in unprepared. We're dead. Jonathan clenched his fists. The idea of men like that being near his son sent a violent shiver through him. Lionel, slouched in the corner of the office, absently flipped a pocket knife open and shut. So what? We storm the place? Rachel shot him a look. That's how we get killed. Lionel smirked. I like a challenge. Jonathan ignored their exchange, his focus sharp. How do we get in? Rachel tapped the screen. There's an access road here, leads to the rear of the property. Security cameras cover the front, but not the service entrance. That's a weak point. Rachel hesitated. More like the least impossible way in. Jonathan straightened. Then that's our way in. Rachel exhaled, rubbing her temple. You're not hearing me. We don't just walk in. We need a plan. We need weapons. We need a way out once we have Galvin. Jonathan nodded. Then we figure it out. But waiting isn't an option. Rachel studied him for a long moment. The man standing in front of her wasn't the same broken shell who had walked into her office days ago. His grief was still there, but it had solidified into something harder, something that wouldn't break under the weight of regret. She saw it now. He wasn't just a father searching for his son. He was a man going to war. Finally, she leaned back. All right, Calloway. Let's plan a heist. The next 48 hours were spent preparing. Rachel dug up schematics of the estate, pinpointing entrances and security vulnerabilities. She called in favors from old contacts, gathering burner phones, stolen keycards, and a list of Blackwell personnel. Lionel handled supplies, using whatever street-level connections he had to secure equipment, lockpicks, stolen radios, even a few homemade explosives. And Jonathan trained. The whiskey was gone, the self-pity erased. He spent hours in Rachel's underground shooting range, his hands tightening around a pistol for the first time in years. The weight of the gun was foreign at first, but muscle memory returned. The recoil bit into his palm, each shot loud, sharp, and precise. He wasn't a soldier. He had spent his life in boardrooms, not battlefields. But the thought of Harrington's men standing between him and his son, he would become whatever was necessary. 3 nights later, the plan was set. Rachel spread a blueprint of the estate across her desk, pointing to the access road. "We enter here. I'll disable the external cameras before we move." She tapped a window on the 2nd floor. "This is where they'll keep him. If Galvin is in that house, he won't be near an exit. He's leveraged. They won't make it easy." Jonathan nodded. "Then we make them." Lionel smirked. "Hell yeah," Rachel sighed. "All right, gear up." The car moved silently through the winding roads, the only sound the faint hum of the tires against gravel. The air was thick, tense, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Jonathan stared out of the window, his jaw clenched tight. His fingers drummed against his knee, restless. He had spent months drowning in grief, rage, and regret. But now, he was here. And in just a few minutes, he would know if his son was still breathing. The thought nearly crushed him. "What do we do when we get there?" he finally asked, his voice low, controlled. Rachel, driving, didn't look at him. "First, we confirm Galvin is there. Then we find a way to get him out, without raising suspicion." Jonathan swallowed. He had imagined seeing his son again 1,000 times, but never like this, never like a heist, never like a war. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating an iron gate wrapped in thick chains. They had arrived. Rachel rolled down the window, pulling out a pair of night vision binoculars. She scanned the area, her face impassive. 2 guards at the entrance, 3 more patrolling the perimeter. Jonathan exhaled. "How do we get in?" Rachel turned to Lionel. "Are you feeling brave?" The kid smirked. "Always." "What do I have to do?" Rachel's eyes flicked back to the guards. "You go up to the gate. Look lost, hungry, whatever you need to do to get their attention. While they're focused on you, Jonathan and I will slip in through the back." Jonathan stiffened. "What if they catch him?" Lionel scoffed. "They won't." His confidence was sharp, effortless, but Jonathan saw the truth beneath it. This kid had spent his life running from people like them. Jonathan's chest tightened. "Be careful," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Lionel grinned, but there was something quietly serious in his eyes. "Always." And then he slipped out of the car. Jonathan and Rachel moved fast, keeping low as they made their way around the property. Rows of trees lined the perimeter, casting long shadows under the moonlight. Rachel reached the chain-link fence, pulling out a pair of bolt cutters. She worked quickly, metal snapping under her grip. At the front gate, Lionel played his part. "Hey, mister," he called out, his voice pitched just right, somewhere between innocence and desperation. "Got anything to eat?" The 2 guards exchanged looks. "What the hell?" one muttered. "Is this kid lost?" the other asked, stepping closer. "Or a thief?" the first grumbled. He reached out, grabbing Lionel's arm. Mistake. Lionel twisted, fast and sharp, and slammed his foot into the guard's shin. The man yelled, releasing him. "Get him!" Lionel bolted, moving like a shadow, disappearing between the trees. The guards chased him, boots pounding against the dirt. Jonathan and Rachel slipped inside. The house was dark, except for a faint glow from a second-floor window. Jonathan felt his pulse hammer against his ribs. Rachel saw where he was looking. That could be him. Jonathan's breath hitched. Rachel drew her gun. They moved forward. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit, the scent of cleaning chemicals lingering in the air. Pipes ran along the ceiling, humming faintly with running water. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows. Then, voices ahead. Jonathan pressed his back against the wall, heart pounding. 2 guards stood near an intersection of tunnels, talking in low, bored tones. Rachel looked at Jonathan, a silent question. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He moved first, stepping from the shadows, grabbing the first guard from behind, and slamming him into the wall. The man barely made a sound before his body went limp. The second guard's eyes widened in shock before Rachel's fist connected with his jaw. He dropped. Jonathan didn't waste time. Move! The inside of the mansion was eerily silent. The floors were polished, too clean, the kind of place where violence happened behind locked doors, never in the open. They reached the main staircase. Rachel checked the map on her tablet. 3rd door on the left. Jonathan took the lead, his pulse a steady drumbeat in his ears. He reached the door. Locked. Rachel crouched to pick it, but Jonathan couldn't wait. He took a step back and kicked the door open. The wood splintered, swinging violently against the wall. And there, on the bed, curled into himself, was Galvin. Jonathan froze. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Galvin looked up. His eyes widened in disbelief. "Dad?" Jonathan crossed the room in an instant, dropping to his knees, pulling Galvin into his arms. The boy clutched onto him, his small hands digging into Jonathan's jacket, as if letting go would make him disappear. "I'm here," Jonathan whispered. "I've got you." Galvin's breathing hitched, and Jonathan felt something inside him crack. Then, the sound of footsteps. Rachel turned, gun raised. She cursed. "We've got company." The door swung open, and there he was, William Harrington, dressed in a tailored black suit, calm, smiling, like he had expected them all along. Jonathan slowly stood, shielding Galvin behind him. Harrington sighed, shaking his head. "Jonathan, Jonathan." His tone was almost amused. "I have to say, I'm disappointed. Did you really think you could just walk in here and take what's mine?" Jonathan's rage burned hot and sharp. "He's not yours." Harrington tut-tutted, stepping further inside. "Oh, but he is. You lost him the moment you let your little empire fall apart." Jonathan's hands curled into fists. "You're going to prison." Harrington laughed. "No, I'm not." And then he raised his gun, pointed directly at Galvin. Jonathan's body reacted before his mind could. He grabbed Galvin and shoved him behind Rachel, stepping directly into the line of fire. Rachel's gun was already up. Lionel had now arrived and was moving into position. For a moment, no one spoke. Harrington smiled, unbothered. "So, what's your move, Calloway?" Jonathan's voice was ice. "Put the gun down." Harrington tilted his head, considering it. Then, the shot rang out, and the room erupted into chaos. Lionel moved first, tackling Harrington before the man could fire again. Rachel took down a guard at the door, her shot clean, precise. Jonathan grabbed Galvin, shoving him behind a chair. "Stay down." Harrington fought back, landing a sharp elbow into Lionel's ribs. The kid stumbled, but didn't go down. Jonathan lunged, fist connecting with Harrington's jaw. The man staggered, but before Jonathan could land another blow, guards flooded the room. Rachel fired. Lionel ducked and weaved, and Jonathan fought like a man with nothing left to lose, because he didn't. And when Harrington hit the ground, clutching his bloody nose, Jonathan stood over him, breathing hard. "You're done," he said. Harrington laughed, blood between his teeth. "Am I?" Jonathan stared at him. Then, without a word, he grabbed Galvin and turned toward the door. "Let's go." And as they ran from the house, Jonathan knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The room felt smaller, suffocating. William Harrington's gun was leveled at Galvin, his smirk as calm as if he were discussing stock prices instead of threatening a child. Jonathan's world narrowed. Everything, the estate, the security guards, even the months of suffering, shrunk to a single point. Galvin, his son, the only thing that mattered. Jonathan's grip tightened around his gun, knuckles white. "Put it down," he said, voice low, controlled. Harrington sighed. "Come on, Calloway. We both know you're not walking out of here with him." He gestured slightly with his gun, casual. "Do you really think you're in control?" Jonathan didn't answer. He didn't need to, because Lionel moved first. A flicker of motion, a blur of fabric and instinct, and suddenly Lionel was launching himself at Harrington, a blade glinting in his hand. Harrington reacted fast, but not fast enough. The gun went off. The crack of the shot echoed through the room, deafening. Jonathan's heart stopped. For a single frozen moment, he thought Galvin had been hit, but the bullet had gone wide, burying itself into the wooden floor as Lionel slammed into Harrington's side, knocking him off balance. Jonathan moved instantly. He grabbed Galvin, shielding him, pressing his son against his chest. Galvin clutched at him with shaking hands, breathing fast, but alive. Alive. Rachel was already pulling her gun. The two Blackwell operatives outside the door hesitated, just a fraction of a second. It was enough. Rachel fired first. The first guard dropped. The second barely had time to react before another shot ripped through his shoulder, sending him crashing into the wall. Harrington shoved Lionel off him, staggering back. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He punched Harrington so hard that the man's head snapped back, his body slamming against the desk. Papers flew everywhere. Harrington gasped, clutching at his bleeding nose. He tried to reach for his gun, but Lionel kicked it away, sending it skidding across the floor. Jonathan grabbed Harrington by the collar, yanking him upright. "You think this is over?" Harrington spat blood onto the floor, eyes wild, but still arrogant. Still convinced he had control. Jonathan slammed him back against the desk. "I know it's over." Harrington laughed, the sound thick with blood. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Calloway." "I don't lose." Jonathan's grip tightened. "You already have." Rachel touched his shoulder. "We need to move. More will be coming." Jonathan hesitated for only a second, then he let Harrington go, letting the man crumple against the desk. Harrington coughed, grinning through split lips and bruised skin. "Run all you want. It won't change anything." Jonathan ignored him. He had what he came for. He turned to Galvin, running his hands over his son's face, his arms, checking for injuries. Galvin shook his head, still pale, still trembling. But he was okay. Jonathan swallowed hard. "We're going home." Galvin nodded, his fingers still gripping Jonathan's jacket, like a lifeline. Lionel jerked his head toward the door. "I hate to break up the moment, but we really need to go." Jonathan lifted Galvin into his arms, holding him close. "Let's move." They ran, through the long, dimly lit hallways, dodging past bodies, slipping into the shadows before more guards could catch them. Rachel had memorized the layout. Every turn was precise, every movement measured. The alarms were still blaring, but they had a lead. For now. The front gate was swarming with reinforcements, but Rachel's SUV was hidden along the access road. If they could get there... A shot rang out. A bullet whizzed past Jonathan's ear, slamming into the wall. They were spotted. "Move!" Rachel shouted. Jonathan ran harder, Galvin clinging to him, heart racing, vision tunneling. Lionel was beside them, his breathing ragged, but his hands steady on his gun. The moment they burst into the night, Lionel whipped around, firing at the two guards on their heels. One went down. The second ducked behind a crate. Rachel was already at the SUV, the doors open. Jonathan threw himself into the back seat, pulling Galvin in after him. Lionel slid in last, barely closing the door before Rachel hit the gas. The SUV skidded on gravel, then sped off into the night, gunfire chasing them. Jonathan pressed his forehead to Galvin's, breathing hard, finally letting the reality sink in. He had him. He had his son. But it wasn't over yet. Not until Harrington was destroyed. Rachel parked in a garage in Manhattan, an old safe house she hadn't used in years. They only had a few hours before Harrington made his next move. Jonathan sat with Galvin still in his arms, reluctant to let go. But revenge wasn't done yet. Rachel was already at her laptop. "There's still one thing left to do," she said. "We take him down, publicly." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "How?" Rachel's fingers flew over the keyboard. "Harrington's careful. He covers his tracks, but not this time." She turned the screen. Security footage. The Blackwell security offices. And there, Harrington, time-stamped, the night of the fire. Jonathan exhaled sharply. "Can you get it to the feds?" Rachel smirked. "Already did." Jonathan watched as Rachel hit send. "This is it," she said. "Evidence proving he was behind it all. Kidnapping, arson, fraud." She leaned back, satisfaction flickering across her face. "It's over." Jonathan's shoulders finally relaxed. Lionel grinned. "Guess we won." Jonathan didn't answer. He just looked at Galvin, the only victory that truly mattered. Galvin blinked up at him, voice small but certain. "Can we go home now?" Jonathan swallowed, nodding. "Yeah, kid. We're going home." And as the first slivers of morning light broke over the city, Jonathan knew he was never going to lose him again. The morning after their escape, the world woke up to a scandal that shook New York's elite to its core. Rachel's evidence had worked fast. The video she leaked to authorities, coupled with the digital footprint connecting Blackwell security to the arson, the kidnapping, and the cover-up, was irrefutable. By midday, the police had raided Harrington's corporate offices. News helicopters circled above as agents in black suits swarmed the building, confiscating hard drives and leading stunned executives out in handcuffs. By the evening, Harrington himself was in cuffs, his face caught in a moment of rare panic as FBI agents escorted him from his penthouse. His empire, his carefully constructed world of wealth, power, and untouchable influence, had collapsed in a matter of hours, and Jonathan Calloway watched it all unfold from the quiet of Rachel's safe house, Galvin curled up beside him on the couch, Lionel watching the news from the floor. No one spoke, until Lionel let out a low whistle. "Damn," he muttered. "That's a long way to fall." Jonathan exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. It should have felt like victory. He had spent months consumed by anger, by grief, by the need to destroy the man who had taken his son. And now it was over. Harrington was done. But the emptiness didn't disappear. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. Jonathan wasn't sure what he had expected. Relief, catharsis, peace. But instead, he felt something closer to exhaustion. Galvin was safe. That was what mattered. But Galvin wasn't the same boy he had lost months ago. He was quieter now, more cautious. He flinched at sudden noises, at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. He no longer spoke much, except in murmured responses to Jonathan's questions. And at night, Jonathan would hear him cry. Not loud, not wailing, just soft, muffled sounds, barely audible through the thin walls. And Jonathan didn't know how to fix it. He could bring his son home. He could give him his life back, his room, his favorite books, his toys. But he couldn't undo the nightmares, couldn't erase what had happened. And that truth killed him. One evening, Jonathan found Lionel packing a small duffel bag in the guest room. Jonathan leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Going somewhere?" Lionel didn't look up. "Yeah. Figured it's about time. Jonathan frowned. Where? Lionel zipped up the bag, slinging it over his shoulder. Does it matter? Jonathan sighed, stepping into the room. You don't have to go. Lionel gave a half smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, I do. He shrugged, trying to play it off. Look, you got your kid back. You don't need me hanging around. Jonathan studied him. Something was off. Where have you been sleeping? Jonathan asked. Lionel blinked, thrown off by the question. What? Jonathan's voice was calm, but firm. Before all of this, before you found me, where did you sleep? Lionel hesitated. That flicker of hesitation was answer enough. Jonathan nodded slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. How long? Lionel shifted uncomfortably. Few years, on and off. Jonathan let out a breath. He had known, somewhere deep down, he had known. But hearing it confirmed hit differently. This kid had spent years surviving alone, getting by however he could, drifting from place to place, sleeping where he found space. And now, he was about to walk out the door with nowhere to go. Jonathan didn't let him. That night, Jonathan made a decision. It wasn't some grand revelation, no cinematic moment of realization. It was simple. He had lost one family once. He wasn't going to let it happen again. When dinner was served that night, Lionel hesitated at the kitchen doorway, bag still slung over his shoulder. Jonathan gestured to a chair. Sit. Lionel frowned. I told you. Sit, Jonathan repeated. Lionel hesitated for a second longer. Then he dropped the bag and sat down. Galvin was already at the table, playing with his fork, silent as usual. Jonathan took a slow breath, glancing between them. My son lost a family, he said quietly. I don't want to see someone else lose theirs too. Lionel's fingers twitched on the edge of the table. He looked at Jonathan, confused, guarded. Jonathan met his gaze. You have a place here, if you want it. For the first time since Jonathan had met Lionel, the kid had no snarky response. He just stared, like he wasn't sure whether to believe it, like no one had ever offered him something like this before. Finally, Lionel scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Are you offering me adoption papers or something? Jonathan smirked. You want some? Lionel laughed. Actually, he laughed. It was small, but real. Jonathan didn't press him further. He didn't need to. The decision had already been made. That night, for the first time in months, Jonathan sat at his dining table with his family. It wasn't perfect. Galvin still flinched at loud sounds. Lionel still looked like he might bolt any second. And Jonathan still had too much guilt and regret pressing down on him. But they were here. And maybe, for now, that was enough. Galvin, his small hands gripping his fork, glanced up at Lionel. Are you staying? Lionel hesitated. Then finally he nodded. Yeah, he muttered. I guess I am. Jonathan breathed out slowly. He hadn't just gotten his son back. He had found something more. A family. And after a long, long time, Jonathan Calloway didn't feel alone anymore.